Alison from Bag Ladybird Learn to Sew. Today I'm going to be showing you how to understitch and the reasons why it's so important to getting a professional finish to your garments and not having your fabric roll to the outside. So I'm making this dress. It is the Friday Pattern Co. Adriana dress and it's got a front and a back facing. So I've attached the facing, we've sewn it on here with a 5/8 seam allowance. You can see this facing is interfaced and the fabric of the dress is not interfaced. So I've finished the edge of this with overlocking. So what we're going to do, we're going to understitch the facing. So when you're understitching, we will be pressing the seam allowance up and towards the facing and stitching the seam allowance to the facing. So I'll show you how to do this in more detail, and I'm going to do one with understitching and the other one without. Compare and to show you the difference in how they sit and the difference in how they behave. So the first thing you want to do is to trim down your seam allowance and clip into it. Because my fabric is really quite fine, I am just going to trim all the seam allowance in half. If your fabric is a bit thicker, you may need to grade it or layer your seam, which is cutting one seam allowance, trimming one seam allowance down more than the other, so you get a sort of stepped effect with your trimming. So now we just need to clip into this curve. So clipping into the curve allows your seam allowance to open up, because this seam allowance here, this smaller inside curve, needs to open out to fit into this larger curve, the other side of the stitch line. So we're just, with your tip of your scissors, clipping up to the stitch line, but not beyond. Okay. Just using the very tip of the scissors, that helps you minimize the risk of cutting through. Okay, so we've done that. I'll do that on the back as well, and then our next step is to the ironing board. With anything where you are needing to get a nice crisp finish, you want anything to be professional, to look professional, pressing is key. So the first thing we're going to do is press this seam open. Now pressing a seam open allows the seam to sit right on the edge. So that would always be my first go-to, to press the seam open, regardless of whether it's going to remain pressed open or whether you're going to press it to one side or another. I would always press open first. Do you know what? I really love this fabric. So we're just pressing this. I'm using a tailor's ham. If you'd like to learn how to make your own tailor's ham, I have just done a sew along within my membership club. The link is in the description box below, and you can find out how to make your own pressing tools, your tailor's ham and seam roll. It just makes pressing things like curved seams so much easier, and they're really quite easy to make your own. Okay, so I've pressed that seam open, and then for the one that I'm going to understitch, I am now going to press both seam allowances towards the facing. So if you can just see there, I'm pressing both towards the facing. So this fabric's relatively synthetic, so I don't want to hold the iron on it too long. I don't want to melt it. With that synthetic content, you can easily melt your fabric. And obviously that's really sad when you're making something you don't have any spare fabric. Well, you have to start again. Not what you want to do. So we're just pressing this, and this is in readiness to understitch. What we're going to do, we're going to stitch the seam allowance to the facing. So you can see the facing side has the interfacing on it. The garment side, the dress side, is not interfaced. So that's how on here you can tell the difference. Okay, so that's all pressed in readiness, and now I'll be stitching down the seam allowance side of that stitch line. To compare, I'm going to press this one open first of all. And understitching is not seen on the right side of your garment, so a lot of people think that you can just skip it. Well, I am here to tell you that no, you should not skip understitching. Should always be done whenever you're using a facing or a lining, and it will just help everything sit in place. So now I'm pressing this, so I'm pressing the seam so it will sit, so your facing will sit to the inside. I'm just going to press this now, a little bit of steam to help hold the press. And here. Press it again from the right side. And that is the interfacing, the understitching skipped. Okay, so understitching. Remember, your seam allowance is pressed towards the facing. What you need to do is just gently pull the facing away from the garment as you sew, so that you don't get it folded under. But if you check your pressing before you sew, what you should have is the seam should sit open. There shouldn't be any of the fabric kind of folded over the seam line. The seam line should be just really obvious, not folded over. Okay, so what we're going to do now is just understitch down here. So I'm stitching just to the right hand side of the stitch line, the original stitch line. So this is on the facing side of the stitch line. So we're stitching on the facing side, and the seam allowance is pressed to the facing side. So everything is going towards the facing. There will be no stitching on the actual garment itself, on the front of the garment. All the stitching will be on the inside, so nobody can see your understitching, which I think is why people think it's a stage that they can skip. They don't fully understand what purpose the understitching has. So understitching holds the fabric, the seam allowance, to the facing, and that helps the seam roll to the wrong side of the garment, so to the inside of the garment, so that you don't see that seam line, and that your fabric, your facing, your lining doesn't roll to the right side of the fabric, so you don't see your lining poking out. You know, it can look quite unpolished if your lining is poking out of your garment. If you're wearing a dress and you can see the lining poking out at the top at the neckline, or anywhere else where your lining would be potential to show, understitching will stop that from happening. So I'm coming round now, the full way around this facing, and you just have to take care on this last bit that it doesn't sort of fold itself over like that. You need to make sure that this is all opened out. So this is where your fingers are key to keeping everything as it should be. That's the riskiest part, is the beginning and end. And we'll just back tack on this. So now you can see on the facing side we have a row of stitching. but on the garment side we have no stitching shown. So all we need to do now to just finish off this bit of understitching is now to press this from the right side, and you'll see what happens is that the seam just rolls just slightly to the inside, to the facing side, like so, and you don't see any seam lines or any stitches from the right side of the garment. So let's go over to the ironing board. We've got this beautiful curve here around this neckline. So this is the back neckline, the one that I have understitched, and I'm just going to press this neckline so it sits nice and neat and flat. And if we look to the wrong side, you will see the seam just rolls just that millimetre, fraction of a millimetre actually, to the wrong side, giving you a really discreet hidden lining or facing. You can see that there. You see just here how this seam line, this rolls to the wrong side with the understitching. And if you look at this from the right side, we don't see any of that stitching at all. It really gives you a beautiful finish to your facings and linings. So this one has no understitching, so we've just rolled this seam to the facing side as we've pressed it, but it just doesn't give as nice a finish. The facing is starting to roll out, you can see that seam a little bit, and that is what happens with wear. When you haven't understitched, your facing or lining can start to show on the right side of your garment. So that is why you should never skip your understitching.
If you've enjoyed this video and want more great Learn to Sew content to help make you a better dressmaker, you can join me over at the Learn to Sew membership club. The link's in the description box below. Remember to like and subscribe to my channel for more great Learn to Sew videos that will help make you a better dressmaker.